Welcome back to the Occult Archives.
Where we,
I don't
dug
to.
the myths and legends behind history's most
Feared books.
feared books. That's it, yeah.
That's us. Episode 235.
235.
We are looking at Theosophy and the New Psychology. Unlocking the hidden mind, subtle bodies, and the forbidden powers of the soul. Big one today.
Big one, that's right, yeah. Always good to jump into the mind, the soul.
Yeah.
A lot going on there.
Yeah. So we have, for this deep dive, Annie Besant. She gave a lecture in 1904 in London where she addresses this exact topic, the relationship between Theosophy and the New Psychology. And this is going to be, I think, really fascinating because it really gives us a unique perspective on consciousness from this period of time, right? Like 40 years before this, the psychology at the time was really focused on physiology.
It was very much grounded in the physical.
Yeah.
The mind was seen as a byproduct of matter.
Yeah.
A result of this mechanical arrangement of the brain.
Like if we can just figure out how this brain works, then we'll know what consciousness is.
Yeah, and it was all about understanding the nervous system too.
Right.
Like this was their primary focus was meticulously, detailing all the parts.
All the parts, yeah. And Besant kind of said, yeah, you got to know about the instruments, right? You got to know about the brain and the nervous system because those are the instruments of consciousness.
Right.
But she had a very different view about the nature of consciousness itself, that it didn't just simply grow out of matter. So this kind of sets the stage for the emergence of what she calls the New Psychology.
The New Psychology.
So what was so new about it?
Well, I mean, it's in the name, right?
Yeah.
It's new. But what that meant for her was that it was open to new facts. It was open to new truths. And really, they weren't content with just the beaten path. They wanted to consider new possibilities, even those abnormal facts, right? The things that kind of deviated from the norm, as long as they could be, demonstrated through reason.
And this is really interesting because she was saying this New Psychology was recognizing that these abnormal facts, these abnormal events that they were looking at were potentially the most important ones to understand the mind.
Yeah, because they were the outliers. They were the things that didn't quite fit in.
Right.
And those things could tell you a lot more than the ordinary stuff.
Exactly. But something that Besant points out is that a lot of these new psychologists, the New Psychology, they kind of just renamed old phenomena. Like they just put a new, more scientifically acceptable name on it.
Yeah, well, repackaging, rebranding, it's an age-old tactic.
Yeah. And so she gives this example. She's talking about internal autoscopy. Have you ever heard of that?
Internal autoscopy. It sounds familiar. What is it exactly?
So it's when somebody, often with a nervous disorder, they're able to perceive their own internal organs.
Oh, okay. Yeah. So they can see their insides.
Yeah, you can see their insides. But this was being observed in the early 19th century, and it was being labeled as clairvoyance.
Ah, that's right.
Which, at the time, that just kind of shuts down a lot of the
conversation. Yeah.
Conversation. It's just like, oh, that's, crazy talk.
Right. But now, by calling it internal autoscopy,
it sounds a lot more scientific.
You can actually discuss it, among intelligent people.
Right. And so she kind of points to this to say, hey, be careful. You're just renaming old stuff. But okay, so this New Psychology is kind of coming up. They're starting to look beyond the traditional boundaries of what psychology is, and this is where Theosophy comes in.
Yeah.
So what is Besant's main argument here about how these two, Theosophy and this New Psychology, how they kind of fit together?
Yeah, so she argues that Theosophy, with its long history of investigation into nature, and consciousness in particular, can really provide a theory, a framework for this New Psychology. Because they were gathering facts, the New Psychologists, but Besant kind of pointed out that they needed a theory to make sense of it all.
Right. Like, what do we do with all of this information that we're getting about all these weird phenomena?
Exactly.
Yeah. So she's saying, Theosophy is kind of like a hypothesis for the scientific world.
Yeah, it's something to consider.
Yeah. And she's saying, okay, if it fits the facts that you're seeing, if it provides rational explanations for these things that you can't explain, and if it can solve, some problems that you're having, then it's worth looking into.
Right. It deserves consideration.
Yeah. But she very carefully calls it a hypothesis, but she's like, no, this is knowledge. This is the truth. That's kind of her position, but she's being very careful to kind of present it to the scientific community in a way that they might accept.
Yeah, she's meeting them where they're at.
Yeah, yeah. So one of the main ideas that Theosophy kind of brings into this conversation, the new psychology, is this concept of the larger consciousness. So what is that?
The larger consciousness basically refers to a field of consciousness and awareness that goes beyond our normal, everyday brain consciousness.
Beyond the brain.
Beyond the brain, exactly. And Besant points out that the new psychology, particularly through the work of people like Myers, F.W.H. Myers, they were also recognizing that there's evidence of this larger field. Things like sudden impressions or commands that come out of nowhere seemingly that can influence our thinking, influence our behavior, sometimes even in defiance of logic. Those times when you have that gut feeling or, you do something completely out of character.
Right. Right, like something comes over you.
Exactly.
Yeah, yeah. And she specifically talks about Myers' book, Human Personality, which, she was really impressed with because it was such a meticulous collection of facts and data about this kind of consciousness, this larger consciousness, where she kind of says, well, he just didn't have the right words for it.
Yeah, she thought he was really onto something, Like he was really close, but she wasn't a fan of the labels he used particularly. Like she felt that he sort of shied away from fully embracing the idea that there's something, truly higher.
Like he wasn't willing to just say, this is higher consciousness.
Yeah, yeah, and she felt that Theosophy, had the answers.
Yeah, like, hey, if you were just, looked at Theosophy, you would have been able to make sense of all this.
Right, exactly. She thought that Theosophy could have, brought order to his findings, could have even helped him differentiate between, things like madness and genius.
Right, right. So we kind of see this idea of madness and genius kind of coming up here. So how does this larger self or larger consciousness, how does it show up in our everyday lives? What kind of evidence did she point to?
Well, the things that we all kind of experience sometimes, things like premonitions, intuitions, those flashes of insight.
Right.
Those moments where you just kind of know something that goes beyond, what your brain is normally processing.
Yeah.
And she kind of asks, well, where do these things come from? Like, how are they reaching us? How are we perceiving them?
Yeah.
What is the organ that senses these things?
And it's interesting because she's also saying that, more and more people are having these experiences, and more people are willing to talk about them, even among, highly educated people.
Yeah, it's becoming more accepted.
Right, right. So it's not just some fringe idea.
Yeah.
Okay, so it's not just these gut feelings or these flashes of insight. What else did she talk about in terms of evidence for this larger self?
Well, she also looked at things like trance states. People in trances often report these heightened sensory experiences.
Right.
Altered states of awareness.
Yeah, and she talks about exaltation of the senses.
Yeah, exaltation of the senses.
Which is a really interesting phrase.
Yeah, yeah. And, she even brings up that internal autoscopy. Again, that's another piece of the puzzle. These phenomena that were once considered, totally occult, now they're starting to be studied and understood under, more acceptable terms.
They're doing that scientific legitimacy.
Right.
Yeah. And this idea of exaltation wasn't just about the senses, right? She talked about exaltation of the intelligence and exaltation of the emotions.
Yeah, she said genius is like, an exaltation of the intelligence.
Like a sudden
burst of insight.
A sudden heightening of consciousness without losing self-awareness.
Right, yeah. And then she also connected, things like heroic courage and mystical ecstasy to an exaltation of the emotions. Like these moments where you're flooded with this intense feelings, intense connection. And she gives this really interesting story about an English missionary in Colorado. This guy was a free thinker.
Yeah, like he didn't believe in God at all.
Yeah, yeah.
Until he had this experience.
Until he had this profound experience. He's traveling through, the mountains, the vast landscape of Colorado, and he has this sudden revelation of God. And for Besant, this was an example of, this larger consciousness breaking through, this deeper level of reality connecting with a receptive mind.
Wow.
It totally transformed the guy.
Yeah. Talk about a consciousness shift.
Yeah.
So Besant goes on to talk about two different views of this larger consciousness. One being the kind of scientific view, and then the other being the theosophical view. So let's start with the scientific view. How did they kind of think about this larger consciousness?
Well, they saw it as a gradual evolution of consciousness, not just in humans, but in all life forms.
Right.
So they linked it to, the perfection of the organism, the increasing complexity of living beings, and
Yeah.
some of them, focused on the role of consciousness in refining these mechanisms.
Right, right. So like the more we use consciousness, the better the instrument gets.
Exactly.
And then she also talks about the subconscious mind. How do they view that?
They saw it as this repository of past experiences, ingrained habits, things that were once conscious but now are kind of automatic.
Like muscle memory
Oh
almost?
yeah,
Yeah. And they thought that these were passed down through
well,
physical heredity.
right, that it was in our genes basically.
Yeah. But Besant kind of points out that this view has some problems when it comes to explaining things like genius.
Right, right. Yeah, she said, genius doesn't really fit this gradual, step by step, evolutionary model.
Yeah, because it's like a sudden.
It's a leap.
Yeah,
It's a leap.
it's a sudden explosion of ability.
Right. And also genius doesn't always mean that the person is like really well adapted to survive in the world.
Yeah, yeah. In
And-
fact, it can be quite the opposite.
Yeah, yeah. So how does theosophy explain the larger consciousness differently?
Well, theosophy starts from a very different place.
Hmm.
It posits the existence of what it calls a supernal entity, a living spirit, a divine fragment of a universal consciousness.
Okay, so it's not coming from matter, it's coming from spirit. Right, right. And this spiritual entity, it veils itself in matter to interact with the different planes of existence.
Okay.
And it unfolds its powers through this interaction.
So it's like we're coming down into matter
Yeah.
rather
yeah.
than evolving up from matter.
Exactly.
And this is how we develop our senses, our organs.
Yeah, because we're receiving vibrations from higher planes, and that leads to the development of organs that can perceive those vibrations.
Okay, so it's like the consciousness comes first.
Yes.
And then the body kind of develops to be able to experience those vibrations.
Exactly. And so those premonitions, the intuitions, the exaltations, even things like mystical visions, dreams, all of these are seen as coming from those higher bodies operating on more subtle planes. And Besant says that this larger consciousness is actually our true self, our real, identity beyond the physical body.
Okay, so the real me is this larger consciousness.
Right, right.
And these things that I'm experiencing, these gut feelings, these intuitions, these are like little glimpses into who I really am.
Yeah, yeah.
Okay, so let's go deeper into this idea of the mechanism of consciousness.
Right.
How do they explain how this all works, this whole multi-layered reality?
Okay, so she starts with this idea that we're not just related to the physical world, we're actually connected to more than that.
More than just the physical.
Yeah. And she draws this parallel between the ancient Hindu teachings of three worlds, right?
Words.
And Meyer's idea of three environments: the physical, the ethereal, and the meta-ethereal, or the spiritual.
The spiritual world.
Yeah. And she says that these worlds, they're not separate. Like, they're not, off in different places. They actually interpenetrate.
They're all around us?
They're all around us. And
Mhm.
our ability to connect with them depends on our bodies, our envelopes. So we have a physical body, we have an astral body, and we have a mental body.
Okay, so it's like having three different...
Yeah, like having three different sets of senses, tuned to different frequencies.
Yeah, yeah. So what happens when we die? What happens to this whole system?
Well, death, she says, is simply the shedding of the physical body, the physical envelope.
Like taking off a coat?
Yeah, yeah.
Okay.
But our consciousness continues. Our astral body and our mental body, they still exist.
So we don't just stop existing.
No. It's just that we can no longer, interact with the physical world directly.
We lose that connection to the physical.
Exactly.
Okay. And so she talks about these different realms having their own ways of communicating.
Yeah, she talks about these three media of communication, each corresponding to one of these worlds.
Okay, so the physical world has its way of communicating.
Right.
The astral world has its way of communicating.
Right.
And the mental world has its way of communicating.
Exactly. And she says these are not, fully developed in most people, but they can be cultivated through practice.
You can develop them.
Yeah, you can develop them.
Okay, and so she also emphasizes that theosophy, they have this view that that we're coming down into rebirth,
Yeah.
not climbing up from the earth,
Right, right. Like the Earth is a temporary stop on our journey.
like a foreign country.
Yeah, yeah.
Okay, so let's go back to the physical body for a second and talk about the nervous system.
Yeah.
What role does that play in all this?
Okay, so she talks about two main systems in the physical world, the sympathetic nervous system and the cerebrospinal nervous system.
Right, right. And I guess the sympathetic nervous system is more of the automatic functions, right?
Yeah, like breathing, heart rate, digestion, that kind of stuff.
Yeah.
And she says there's been this evolutionary shift where the ego used to primarily use the sympathetic system, but then as we evolved, the cerebrospinal system developed, and that became the main way that the ego expresses itself.
Okay, so it's like we've kind of upgraded our operating system.
Yeah, yeah. And she says that as the ego establishes certain, conscious functions, it kind of hands those over to the sympathetic system to handle automatically.
It's like, okay, you got this. I'm going to go work on other stuff.
Yeah, yeah.
Okay, and then she talks about fixed ideas.
Yeah.
How does that fit into this whole nervous system thing?
Yeah, so fixed idea, she says, can be these remnants of past moods, past experiences, things that we've kind of handed over to the sympathetic system, but then they kind of assert themselves in inappropriate ways.
Like it's like a broken record in our mind.
Yeah, yeah. And she contrasts this with fixed ideas that are more positive, like the ideas of martyrs or saints or heroes, people who have these noble ideas that just dominate their actions.
Yeah, so it's like a fixed idea can be either positive or negative.
Yeah.
Depending on where it's coming from.
Exactly.
Okay. And then she talks about the connection between madness and genius.
Yeah, she talks about how there's this instability in both.
Yeah, like a genius can be unstable.
Yeah. And
Yeah.
someone who's suffering from some kind of mental illness can also be very brilliant in certain ways.
Right.
And she talks about hysteria.
Hysteria.
Yeah, what's hysteria?
Hysteria was a condition that was diagnosed, back in the 19th century, and it was characterized by all sorts of, emotional and physical symptoms.
Okay.
And she says that hysteria, it actually resembles genius in the condition of the brain.
So there's this kind of similarity there.
A similarity between hysteria and genius.
Yeah.
In the brain.
In the brain.
Okay.
And she says that this instability, it can be caused by a surge from the sympathetic system, or it could be the pressure of higher forces on a brain that's not prepared to handle them.
Right.
So it's like, you have this energy coming in, this higher energy, but if the brain isn't ready, it can cause problems.
It's like trying to run too much power through a weak circuit.
Yeah, yeah.
Yes.
And she talks about how, many saints, they were considered neuropaths because they were overstraining their brains with these higher vibrations.
Right.
She quotes Maudsley and James, and they said that, these incomplete or neurotic minds, they can be more receptive to inspiration from higher realms.
Okay, so it's like the normal brain is kind of adapted for worldly affairs.
Right.
But when you start bringing in these higher vibrations,
Yeah.
it can throw things off.
Yeah, it's not equipped to handle it.
Right, right. And so the genius, their brain might be unstable, but it's a sign that life is trying to improve the mechanism. It's like the cutting edge of evolution.
Yeah, it's the leading edge.
The leading edge. Okay, so how do we train this mechanism? Like how do we intentionally develop this consciousness?
Well, she talks about yoga.
Yoga.
Yeah.
So this is where yoga comes in.
Yeah.
Okay.
And she says that yoga is a science of training the consciousness to work in answer to these three worlds.
Okay, so it's not just about stretching and breathing exercise.
And no, it's much more than that.
It's about training the consciousness.
Yeah, yeah.
Okay.
And she says those premonitions and intuitions, they're coming from the astral and mental bodies responding to those ethereal and metethereal environments.
Okay.
But she says that real, clear, definite knowledge that comes directly from the spirit.
Okay, so there's different levels of knowing.
Yeah.
Okay. And then she kind of ties this to our instinct for art and beauty and religion. She says those are not just, byproducts of evolution.
Yeah, she says they're essential. for the evolution of consciousness.
Okay.
Like art is a glimpse of eternal beauty.
Okay.
And religion is the search for God, for oneness with the divine.
Okay, so these are not just things that we do for fun.
No, no.
They're actually helping us evolve.
Yeah. They're connecting us to something higher.
Okay, so let's break down these levels of consciousness that she talks about. The waking consciousness, the subconsciousness, and the superconsciousness. Let's start with waking consciousness.
Okay, so waking consciousness, she says, is the consciousness that we normally experience, in our daily lives.
The one we're using right now.
Yeah, the one we're using right now. It's the one that we experience through the brain, or the principal ganglion in less developed creatures.
Okay.
And it's comprised of, the percepts and concepts that we get from the outside world.
Our senses.
Yeah, yeah.
Okay.
And it's limited by the physical mechanism of the brain, how developed the brain is.
Okay.
It's limited by the past experiences that we have stored in these permanent atoms.
Okay, so our past experiences limit our current consciousness.
Yeah, yeah.
Okay.
And it's also limited by the lords of karma, who shape the general mold of the brain.
Okay, so there's kind of a blueprint that we're born with.
Right, right.
And that limits what we're able to perceive and think about.
Yeah, and she says attention is really important.
Attention.
Yeah.
Okay.
She says that attention is like, the eye focusing on a particular object.
Okay.
So we can choose what to focus on.
Right, right. So we have some control over what we're conscious of.
Yeah, yeah. Okay, so then there's the subconsciousness.
Subconsciousness.
And she says this includes, these dim relics of the past.
Like old memories.
Yeah, old memories, ancestral tendencies, things that we've inherited from our ancestors.
Okay.
Even echoes of animal existences.
Wow, okay.
And these are stored in the sympathetic system.
Okay.
She says, sometimes we have these causeless terrors or these fears that come up, and that's where they're coming from.
Like they're coming from this deep past.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. And she differentiates that from thoughts that have just, sunk into the deeper layers of the brain, which can be revived by hypnotism.
Right.
So there's a difference between those two.
Okay, so the subconscious is more than just, forgotten memories. It's like a upper level of the mind that holds these ancient things.
Yeah, yeah.
Okay. And then she talks about this border area between the subconscious and the superconscious.
Yeah, this in-between zone.
The in-between zone. And
she says that this comes through the sympathetic system as well, but it's not from our past.
Okay, so it's not our personal past.
Right.
Okay.
It's more like, these vague intuitions or fears of impending events that originate on the astral plane and then affect our astral body.
Okay.
And then they kind of filter down to the physical brain through the sympathetic system.
Okay, so it's like the astral body is picking up on something.
Yeah, yeah.
And then that gets communicated to the physical brain.
Exactly.
Okay, so then super consciousness, what is that?
Super consciousness. So she says this is the consciousness on the higher planes, the super physical planes.
Okay.
And this information comes directly into the brain.
Not through the sympathetic system.
Not through the sympathetic system. It's like the astral senses communicating with the physical senses.
Yeah.
Not the astral body, surface to the sympathetic system.
Okay, so it's a more direct connection.
Yeah, yeah.
Okay. And she says, don't be afraid if you start seeing things or hearing things.
Yeah, as long as you're healthy and sane.
Yeah.
If you're not feeling well or if you're having, mental problems, then maybe be careful.
Yeah, that's a sign that something's not right.
Yeah.
Okay.
But if you're healthy and you're feeling good and you start having these experiences, it could be a sign that you're opening up to this higher consciousness.
Right. And then she talks about genius and inspiration.
Yeah, she says that the promptings of genius, they come directly from the higher self into the brain.
Okay.
And she says that can cause, instability because the brain is being stretched. It's being pushed beyond its normal limits.
Yeah, it's like a muscle that's being, worked out for the first time.
Yeah.
It's going to be sore.
Yeah. And she talks about this paradox where, sometimes genius is accompanied by moral irregularity.
Right.
Like you have these brilliant people who are also, really messed up in other ways.
Right, right.
And she says this is because the force from the higher planes, it's transmuted in these unprepared vehicles.
Okay.
So it's like, you have this pure energy coming in, but if the vessel isn't clean,